Welcome to RIVE, Reflections in Veterinary Education. In this episode, we're excited to talk with you about some ways we could consider innovating in veterinary education programs, and we do mean innovating. The current model, at least as the three of us see it, isn't sustainable for a number of reasons, including a shortage of veterinarians willing and able to work in academia, the ever-increasing amount of knowledge needed to be successful in the field, the rigidity in the current timeline for training new veterinarians, and the financial impacts of the current model, both personally and in the bigger picture, to name a few. So what can we do to alleviate some, or maybe even all of these issues? Create some new curricular models that are at least new to veterinary medicine. And we've got some ideas. So we're going to get started talking about those tonight. So do you want me to start, Bobby, or I know you have some really good ideas. So
No, you get it started and I'll get excited and jump in. Don't you worry.
All right. Yeah, feel free. So some of the things that I floated about with this group and with a few other people who are a little bit more receptive is the concept of potentially a part-time veterinary curriculum. And so I did a little bit of research to see if there were other professional programs out there that do a part-time program. And the only one I could come across was law school, which I was familiar with.
And I think nursing, like depending on how you're defining professional, but I know there are a lot of part-time nursing programs.
Yes, there are a lot of part-time nursing programs. I guess I was looking at nursing or at professional
Like
programs
doctorate
that were
level.
at the graduate level,
Yeah.
doctorate level, not to discount what nursing does, but just because they're primarily an undergraduate program. And so I did find that the American Bar Association has approved 79 part-time law programs, including 9 hybrid learning programs, many of which are big name schools. So Loyola University Chicago has all 3. They have a full-time in-person, a part-time program, and then a hybrid learning program. And hybrid is partly in-person and partly virtual. And so does Seton Hall. And then those with hybrid learning law programs include universities like Syracuse University, the University of Dayton, University of Denver, and the University of New Hampshire. So it's not small schools that don't have that have these programs.
Yeah.
I also did a little research into the human medical field just to see if anybody was doing it there. And there are a couple of programs there with different approaches to the curriculum. The one that was the most interesting to me was the University of Illinois medical program. They allow a decelerated first year program, basically, so you can stretch your first year over 2 years, but then the same pace for the last part of the program. So I thought that was interesting. And then the University of Minnesota allows a leave of absence during their MD program, but and allows for up to 6 years to complete it, but it's not a part-time program. So you can take a year or 2 or go do another degree. So it's more similar to sort of a dual degree program or something like that. I did find that many of the medical programs offer a quote unquote flexibility to complete school on a case-by-case basis, but they don't really have a formal part-time or what I would consider a flex time curriculum. And there are accelerated programs as well. The only accelerated program I know of right now in veterinary medicine is the University of Arizona, which is a brand new school, and they're getting ready to graduate their first class next year. And they do it in a 3-year program where they go all year round. So we have.
Can you argue the island schools are accelerated? Because if you don't take your summers, right, you finish in like 2 years and a half or something.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Yeah,
I think Ross,
like
you get through in like 3 years, or they also go all year round. So even though it seems like it's accelerated, it's not necessarily accelerated in the sense that it's a shorter amount of time over the years, but it's the same amount of time overall in the program. So I think it's a little bit of a
kind of misleading.
Yeah, because they're going all year round rather than having.
So here's my question, Catherine. And from what you're describing and what I'm familiar with is there are part-time programs, but they're still time-based programs, meaning you still have to say, you must spend this many days, hours, months, years, and they're never competency based, right? It's not like, oh, you already have a degree in microbiology or you already have this. And so therefore, like maybe you can just skip some of this or test out of these sections. Because I remember years ago now, I was at one of the veterinary education collaborative conferences, and the keynote speaker was a physician and was just making the point that like, why is this based on time? Like, what's the magic of 4 years or 3 if you compress it? But like, we're basically saying, once you've worked this much time, you should be good. And it's like, well, no, maybe we should do it more like martial arts or astronauts or other programs where they go, no, once you have proven that you can accomplish this, then you move on to the next level. And then it's not about part-time, full-time. It's about your pace, whatever works for you. So I've never come across any big program like in any health professions education that has gone that I would consider that maybe not even innovative, but radical, because nobody wants to do that. It would be complicated. Don't get me wrong, but I think it'd be amazing.
Yeah, so that actually kind of leads into the next idea I had was this flex
That was
time.
my plan.
Yeah, like, nice lob there for me. Is the idea of a flex curriculum, right? This flex time curriculum, which I've talked to a number of people, and I think Eric, even you've brought this up in the past, that like when you're going to get a PhD, it's not a set amount of time that you earn that PhD in. Then you have 7 years from the time you start taking classes until you would basically age out of that program. And within that 7 years, you take those classes, you do that research, you put together your project, and you have 7 years to demonstrate that you're capable of being an expert in whatever field you've chosen to pursue a doctoral degree. Now, clearly, it's a little bit easier to be flexible in a program that doesn't require sort of all the complicated
120 students being the same thing too.
120 students, all the clinical skills, all of the things that are involved with that. But I do think that the opportunity to do something like a part-time or flex curriculum, it would be complicated. It would be hard. It would be a mess for the first few years, but ultimately would really serve the profession and address a lot of those issues that I talked about in the introduction in terms of financial, in terms of personal time and health and well-being, and just the fact that people, I think, would learn more and absorb more while they were going through the program.
So why do you think that medicine hasn't done this, for example? Like if law has done this, why hasn't medicine done this? Why hasn't pharmacy done this? Why don't we do it? You know, what do you think the answer to that is?
I mean, I personally think part of it is the whole issue of we've always done it this way. It's worked. I think that's part of it. I think there's a lot of old school people who firmly believe that the system is good enough. But I also think that
I would argue about that it's worked.
Yeah.
You know, when you say it's worked, I would argue
working. You're like, is it
working?
That's what I mean. I think it's in a quotation thing.
Yeah.
It works, right?
Yeah.
But I also think that it's a money issue, right? So one of the biggest arguments that I get from people when I say we need to expand the curriculum or expand and they're like, well, we can't do that because we're already creating so many students who go out with so much debt if we add another year or another 2 years. So maybe we could do like a 2+4 or a 3+3 program.
Who says we're necessarily adding years, right?
Well, that's the thing. And if we do a flex curriculum, you don't pay per year when you do your PhD, you pay per credit hour, right? Yep. So professional programs are the only ones that require you to pay per semester or whatever. Mm-hmm. So we would have to change the way maybe we build. So maybe students would only be paid per credit paying per credit hour versus paying for an entire semester's worth of work.
Which is not that innovative. Places are doing that. Like it's not like we have to invent a new system for doing that. Yeah. Right. So that's not a very good excuse to not do it.
Agreed. So I think I don't know the specific answer to that. I suspect that all of those things have come into play. I
think it's because change is hard.
And change is hard.
And you're like, is what we're doing good enough? Is it worth it? And it's also, there's an unknown to this, right? Like there's no guarantee that if you revamp the whole thing, it's necessarily going to work equally well or even better. Right. And so I think there's always a fear that what if it's worse, right?
I find that really interesting though, because especially in the CBVE movement, the competency-based veterinary education, and parallel to that, or actually preceding the CBVE movement is the CBME movement, right? The competency-based medical, but competency-based is not a time-based system,
time-based,
right? It's a mastery-based
antithetical.
And so you're 100% right. It's like antithetical to everything that we talk about when we're talking about competency-based. When I was learning how to play an instrument, it was competency based, right? My music level I was playing whole notes and I was playing very slow things and I was playing things that were well within my range until I got to a point where I was then capable. And I actually was accelerated in that. So I was playing more advanced stuff than some of my classmates, and some of my classmates needed a little bit more time to catch up. Yep. That's truly competency based. So if we're saying competency based and saying, but you have to do it in 4 years, we're not really doing competency based.
Nope.
And in my opinion and in my interpretation,
we're doing a blending. It's a blending of it.
Does the COE have any restrictions on this in terms of full time, et cetera? Like if you were to do this, basically, would the AVMA rubber stamp it or not?
I am not, I'm not an expert in this, but in my understanding and the little research that I've done into it, and Bobby, you might know more about this, but there's nothing in the COE guidelines that says a curriculum must be 4 years long.
Anything about time.
There's nothing that says that, because it is ostensibly a competency-based outcome. It says when your students have met these competencies on a consistent basis, then they're ready to be advanced to the level of being an entry-level professional.
Yeah.
That takes
I've never seen
years.
anything that says we require them to log this many hours or
No.
anything like that. And so now that doesn't mean they would approve it, because that 4 years is so entrenched in like our collective, understanding and psyche of things. But I think if you went by the letter of what all the requirements say, I don't know that they could argue and say, well, no, it has to be this amount of time.
But-
Yeah.
And clearly there's a 3-year program at Arizona, and Ross is accredited, and St. George's is accredited, and the RBC is accredited, and the RBC is a
Get
5-year
around
program.
it because they're, whatever. But I think there's room for that. And I don't think there's anything that says it must take this long. Yeah. So I think it's potentially doable. I always wonder, is it easier to start a new program, brand new, and do something radical, or change an existing program? I tend to think it's easier to start a brand new program in that way, because you don't have all this entrenched, everybody's here.
Yeah.
But that's also hard in and of itself, right? To start something new. So I don't think it's impossible, for an existing program to decide we're going to do this totally differently, or even this would be cool, is to offer in parallel, right? I mean, not perfectly parallel, because some of them wouldn't be going at the same pace, but is there a way that you can design an optional, like some students could opt into a program like this?
Yeah.
And that way you could also be tracking students to be like, hey, look, this is okay. They're meeting all the same, requirements that had existed before. It's just some of them are saying, hey, I was a tech for 7 years. And so some of these things I can just boom, breeze right through. And I can test out maybe of some of these courses or some of these, if I can prove to you on day one that I'm competent in these 6 things, then why do I have to take a class on it?
We do that for undergrads, right? That's what the whole CLEP system is about.
Yeah.
And it accelerated, like students who go to college for their last 2 years of high school, and then they come out with 4-year degree in 2 years because they've already done. I mean,
I did
all
and stuff. Yep.
right. Like there's all kinds of opportunities in other programs. Why are we so rigid within, and not just veterinary medicine, but within medical education itself?
Yeah.
So I don't know, Eric, what the answer to your question is, but it does seem to be an issue among these professions specifically, which I find really interesting.
I think there's a lot of money to be made. You know, and that's the thing that kills me. Like, why hasn't anyone plopped down some online program of veterinary medicine? Because there are thousands of pre-vets.
Let's do it.
Want to get into vet school,
Well, and that's, go ahead, Bobby.
Well, I was just going to say that I think, when I think about the logistics of doing something really, flex like this or at your own pace is, the first thing I can imagine is, okay, well, I can't schedule classes that I teach at certain times if everybody's at a different pace. But if we have all of this technology available to us, where somebody can go through and do, an online, module-based, video-based, and then there are opportunities to say, okay, I'm going to go to this lab and demonstrate these competencies. And, I just don't think it would be that hard. Now, it would be very hard to run a full-time curriculum as it currently exists. And then at the same time, like you would have to hire additionals, if a school wanted to try to do it both at the same time, or you have to retrain, your current staff and pull people away. So it is going to be resource intensive, but I don't think it's not I think it's so doable.
Yeah. And so I tell people a lot that, when I was in full-time practice, I would joke around on a slow day, or if I did something that, made some silly calculation error or something like that, and somebody called me on it, I'd be like, oh, well, I mean, I did go to online vet school. So, kind of say it as a joke. And now I'm like, oh, I probably shouldn't say that anymore, because with the pandemic, we've shown that it's not ideal. It's not perfect. And certainly not every student is going to opt for that, but there's certainly room for those virtual components, which I think is another thing that we could talk about, is doing a hybrid program, which would lend itself more to a flex or part-time curriculum. And you can't maybe do it synchronously the entire time, but you can have specific office times or times where, okay, I'm going to be online, sitting in my office doing work. available to you on Zoom. You can log in, log out, just like virtual office hours. You can ask questions, we can have meetings, but they're not mandatory meetings. And you're probably going to get as many students as those as you get in class these days anyway, given that you use lecture capture.
Yeah.
So I really think that the pandemic in some ways helped us understand that we could do these things, and they're going to take work and they need more practice, but certainly it's possible. I mean, I will say, neuroscience tells us that it's better for adults to be in person, and that generally they're going to learn more and do better. But if they have flexible time to really go back and review, would that then offset the fact that maybe they can't be there in person, and you'd have to figure out the lab situation and all that.
Yeah. And I would love it to be
contract that
blending,
out.
right? You have a blending where you say, yeah, here's the lab is open from this time, and there are
Right.
instructors in there to help you with certain things. And you or you could have mini courses that are available, multiple times. Like here's this 2-week course that's available 6 times throughout the year.
Exactly.
So depending on where you are in your training, like it's not slowing you down. Because here's the other thing. We like to think that everything you learn in vet school has to happen in a certain order, but like every vet school does it in a different order.
Exactly.
We know that we haven't figured the perfect order out. So why does it have to be like, even if you said you're going to take this class, but you can take it at the time that works well with your overall curriculum. So I would imagine like a blended system where some of it might be online and asynchronous. Some of it would be synchronous and in person. Cause I agree. I think there are some advantages to some of that. And and maybe you offer versions of both, like certain topics. Okay, this person has a background in biochemistry, so maybe there are certain courses that are available to them. I don't know, or maybe they take pre-tests, or we could go into all the details of this, but there might be different ways that we say certain courses are offered to certain students in a way. I don't know, but I think those are all questions that we need to start asking, so that one, we can, be more inclusive, right? We can get more people. And we need more veterinarians. We don't have enough. And the projections are that we are going to continue to not have enough. And I don't see a whole lot of brick and mortar vet schools opening, and they're not popping up every other week. So that's not yet a problem. But somebody is, I think you're right, Eric. Somebody's going to come through and be like, there's a potential to make money. And somebody's going to turn this into like a for-profit situation.
I think we should do it. Come on.
We need like 10 or 20 million in startup capital is the problem.
I think we could find that money. Honestly, we could find the money. I mean, Texas Tech found 90 million. So I think it's doable. But I do want to go back to something that you both have brought up, is this, why do we do it this way? I think we do have to figure out what those barriers are and break them down. And I'm reminded of when I was going through my doctoral program, there were several moments that sort of blew my mind, but this one blew my mind the most. And so my professor was saying, we were talking about sort of sequencing, right? And why we learn things the way we learn things, especially in science education. And I don't know about you all, but my suspicion is that when you were going through your science courses in high school and in college, it was like, you're supposed to take biology first, and then you're supposed to take chemistry, and then you're supposed to take physics. That's the sequence that you take your science classes in, right? So she looked at us one day and she's like, yeah, everybody does it that way. Does anybody know why we do it that way? And we're all like, because we're supposed to. She's like, no, literally the reason that people take it in that order is because it's alphabetical.
I was just going to say, is it alphabetical?
It's alphabetical. And actually, you really should be taking physics first because it's reasoning and helping you understand the processes. Then you should be taking chemistry because it's the hard science and the math. And then you should be taking biology because it's a lot more sort of esoteric and a lot more abstract. And so you're going from the more concrete and to the more abstract. So we actually should be doing it in exactly the reverse order based on neuroscience and learning. But because it was in alphabetical order, people decided that that's the order we should be taking our classes in. So it's stuff like that. And you're like, really, what other stupid stuff are we doing? Because, we've always done it that way, or it's alphabetical, or it just seemed to make the most sense at the time. And we had no reason other than it's the same thing. I think we've had the conversation about why is 70% a passing score in so many places, right? It's completely spurious. Nobody has any supporting evidence to say that that's better. So I do think at the root of it all, people want to say there's a reason for it, but I don't know that anybody really knows what the reason is. It really, truly does come down to, we've always done it this way and it works, in quotations.
Yeah, that's, the most important question we can ever ask is why. And whenever the answer is because we've always done it, that sounds like tradition. Tradition is not a reason to do something, right? Tradition is something we do is like, oh, well, every Christmas we get together and we read this particular story. Like that's a tradition. You brush your teeth every day. That's not a tradition. You do that because there are reasons for it, and we can name the reasons, right? Like there are specific reasons. So just because you've always done something, if you can't name the reason, then it's a tradition, and tradition is something that can easily be changed. And it's not really a good justification for, 4 years and $250,000 worth of somebody's education.
Right.
So, yeah.
So I do wonder if when I was thinking about this topic, I was thinking about the phenomena of the cohort going through vet school, and how it's basically like high school version 2.0. You're
Yeah.
4 years, same people, same class, etc. So I wonder if one were to imagine a reason why, right? Like, how important is that cohort effect?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like, what's the social impact of
Exactly. Right. Like, there's so much hidden curriculum. Like, is this necessary to be in the same classroom with these people in a brick and mortar place to get all those pieces of being a professional? Right? Like showing up on time and wearing professional clothes. Like, I don't know. I'm just wondering if that could be a rationale.
Question.
I
Yeah.
think there are certainly people who would argue that that is part of the process, but based on what's happening at Virginia Tech right now, I would argue that that doesn't really matter. Students aren't showing up wearing professional clothing. They don't necessarily behave any more professionally than they would. And in fact, in some cases, probably less professionally. And I'm not sure that the whole, I think one of the things we talk about, like, for example, we don't want to take transfer students in because they have a difficult time integrating into the classroom because they've missed out on the first year or two of getting to know students and going through all that, which I do think there's some legitimate psychology behind that. But I think if we were to think more collectively of veterinary students versus the class of 2022, the class of 2023, the class of 2024, that there would be opportunities then for movement among those students and peer and near peer teaching that would occur that might actually form a more cohesive, larger group of colleagues and peers when you graduated. That wouldn't be so, I went to Texas A&M and I didn't know everybody in my own class, much less the classes, ahead of me and then behind me. And, there might have been people in those classes that I would have really connected with and maybe learned more and wanted to study with, or that could have tutored me in the classes that I was struggling with on a more informal basis. So, I think that's probably got some teeth to it, your argument, Eric, but I'm not sure it has enough teeth for me to convince me, at least, that it's a necessity.
I also don't think that if you were to change it, you would have to lose all of that, right? Like, so just because everybody's not taking the same classes, like sitting in a lecture hall is not particularly social if it's going well, right? But like, who said you can't still have all the clubs? Who said you can't still have all the meetings and the luncheons and things like I gave a talk at a lunch today, and of course, all of the I did a poll. What year are you guys? They were all sitting together by their, groups, whatever.
Right, exactly.
But maybe there would be less of that. There'd be more intermingling, but they still have the opportunity to socialize again. So I don't know that I would, for what the reasons you're mentioning, Eric, would love the idea of it like being completely remote 100% of the time. Because I do think, again, we know that, some of this being in person is important, but I don't know that 100% of it needs to be important, or it needs to be in person. And I think there's still going to be plenty of opportunities for that social aspect and those extracurricular things that could be plenty good. And now I also think there's individual variation. I think there are some people who would really want that. And again, they have the flexibility to maybe do more of that if that's kind of their thing. But somebody else who's like, well, but I have kids to take care of, or I've got, a sick parent or something. It's like, as much as I would like to, this is my priority. And this allows me that flexibility. So again, I think it just creates a lot more customization or customizability, but I don't think you have to completely give up the social aspect.
Agreed. And I think that was one of the big arguments with the homeschooling movement, right? There at the beginning, people were like, oh, the homeschool kids aren't getting the socialization. They're not getting the interaction, so that they're not learning the people skills. And the homeschoolers recognized that and said, well, we're sending our kids to go play soccer with other kids. We're taking them to recreation opportunities to go swimming or, play sports or do something that allowed them that interaction. And I think that as a whole, that argument against homeschooling has pretty much disappeared now because there are certain people who homeschool their kids because they don't want their kids to go out, and they're a little bit weird. But as a whole, the kids who are being homeschooled are just as well adjusted and capable of getting into good colleges as others. And so
you might just have to be mindful of that, right? Like, so I mean, I think it's a very valid point to say, are we going to miss out? So we might have to be a little more intentional or intentionable about providing those opportunities and encouraging that socialization. And, maybe there's a way to foster study groups or, other forms of interaction. It doesn't always have to be like the extracurricular things. So I think it would be worthwhile, if you're going to do something, is to plan for, discrete, intentional opportunities for that socialization, so that they're there. Because I think you're right, Catherine, like there are some people that those kids don't get socialized, and that's probably weird, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. You just have to think about it. You have to be like, okay, I have to make sure that I'm providing these opportunities. And I think that could still be very doable. So yeah, there's a lot of things to think about, but I think none of them are unsolvable problems.
Yeah. Something, Catherine, that you mentioned about the peer and near peer student teachers is something that I've been really excited about for a long time. We went out to, I think it was University of New Hampshire, who was trying to convert their med school to completely flipped classroom and go away from lectures. And as part of that, I believe it was their senior students, maybe it was their junior students, had a required like academic rotation where they were inserted into the classrooms, and they were part of the instructors who were going around helping the first and second years. And when I used to be at Georgia, and the surgery lab was near the hospital, when it was quiet, I'd send the seniors over to help the sophomores with anesthesia in the surgery lab. And I think that's just fantastic. And I think that should be universal, and I don't know why it isn't.
Yeah, that's a really great point, Eric. I've been a lot of places where there are opportunities for students to do that. Like they can sign up to be TAs. And you were talking earlier, Catherine, about like PhDs and master's programs where that's like often a part of your job. But I love what you're saying, Eric, is that it was a course. Like this is required and you're going to go. I mean, talk about all the education stuff. Imagine if we trained some people, even just got figured out who had a spark for this and who was excited. And then you go, okay, cool. We're going to pluck you over here and we're going to turn you into a teacher. But everybody can benefit from that. Right. I mean, we all know, like, you really understand something better when you have to explain it to somebody else. Like, it's just so good for your own learning. So even if somebody has no interest in ever teaching, I think there's a value. I love that idea. I'm like, all right, how do we make this happen?
I know. I love that idea too. And along what the lines that Bobby was saying is that I think, for those students who are potentially interested, because academia is one of those significant areas of shortage in veterinary medicine, among others. So if we could build a pipeline for that and find those students, and one of the other benefits I would foresee happening is that those students would be a little bit more empathetic towards their professors, right? Because I continue to have conversations with students that I taught when I was teaching the Masters of Public Health students who are going through PhDs now. We meet every 6 weeks or whatever. And several of them are having to teach as part of their duties as a PhD student. And one of them came back to me and was like, I don't like doing this. Students suck. Students are really hard. And I don't know how you put up with us and put up with all this stuff and planned all this and did all this. And I was like, yeah, you're appreciating now how difficult it can be to be a professor. And he was like, yeah, I don't want to do this for the rest of my life. Like, this is terrible. Who wants to put up with crappy students their entire life? Right. So as students, we complain about our professors, but if they don't understand as students what professors really go through on a daily basis. So in that sense, they get a better, and they may not get a full taste of it, but they get enough to know. And a couple of them are like, no, I love it. And it's great. And that tends to be more of the reaction, but it's really important for them to experience that.
But they still understand the other side, even if they're enjoying it. They're like, okay, there were parts of this I didn't get. And the same phenomenon or very similar is I, trained residents for many years. And then occasionally one of those residents, you would become a faculty member, and they were like, sometimes they just want to like, I just apologize for all of, just a general blanket apology.
For being such a jerk.
I remember telling my parents that at some point when I hit a certain age, and I was just like, I just think back to, who I was then. And I was not the worst kid, but still I was just like, I just feel the need to just apologize in general, just a blanket. I apologize. I'm sure that I could list them all out. We don't have time. I know, I'm sorry. And so it's so funny though, how, you never really know until you're in that boat. And you always think we all live in our own bubbles, right? And one of my favorite bits of research that I learned about several years ago is that we all overestimate what we do compared to others, right? Like they can take adults to put them together in a group and like, okay, you're going to do a group project. And at the end of this, you're all going to estimate what percentage did you contribute to the final product. And the total is almost invariably over 100%. So we're just not good at that, but it's not like it was sometimes 110% and sometimes it was 75. Like we all overestimate, because if I can't see it, hear it, smell it, taste it, it's not happening. And so, all the times I can remember saying this when I was a resident, okay, like, what is the secret passageway that the faculty have so they can disappear and we can never find them? It was, I always thought of like the Clue board where there was like that secret passage to, like, get to the other. And I was like, when I become faculty, do I get like a key to that secret passageway, And then you become faculty and you're like, because I have a million things that I am being pulled in all these different directions. But as a resident, you have no idea. And as an intern and all that stuff. And so, yeah, I love the idea of giving people a taste of it. So one, they have that empathy, that appreciation, but also they find out like, is this something I really would want to do? Which is also nice before you get into a job to get a little taste. But yeah, I love that.
Yeah. And just like anything else, I think you can be as transparent as you want to be, but until they really experience it, they never
Not the
know.
same.
Because I would tell my MPH students all the time, I'm like, listen, I have other things that I have to do. This isn't the only class that I teach. These, this isn't the only duty that I have. This is what actually on a couple of classes would pull up my calendar and say, this is what my calendar looks like. So if you think you're the person who's the busiest in the room, I'm going to tell you that you're not. So have some patience and we'll work on it. And they'd be like, yeah. And they appreciated it, but they don't really appreciate it until they get and experience it. Just like you don't appreciate all of the things that go into whatever you don't understand.
Yeah.
So I want to go back to you a little bit that, the idea that we would have to have in-person labs or hybrid teaching or in-person component. And I hear what you all say, that in-person teaching is more effective than digital or online for adults. And I agree with that. I guess my thought is, what if you delivered high quality instruction that was online? Because we all know there are faculty in our brick and mortar buildings that don't have learning objectives and read their PowerPoints.
Yeah.
So are you going to tell me that is more effective than someone doing something online with like really best practice pedagogy?
It's a really good point.
Except that, I think
what if in our imaginary school, every faculty had a teaching certificate before they started?
Awesome.
Yeah. I think you're right. I think if everything else is equal and you have an online and an in-person, the in-person's probably going to win out. But in the real world, everything else isn't equal. And so I think you're right. I think, my preference would be for a hybrid, for some of the reasons you mentioned too, is about the social aspect of things. Do I think that would be absolutely required? No, I think you're right. I think there are aspects that could be done. I think it could potentially be done 100% remotely. I think that's potential. The assessments would have to be really thought out. And so again, I'm never a fan of saying something's not possible. Like, yeah, I think anything's possible. I don't think if I were designing a program, I would start there. But I think you're right. I think you make a really good point, Eric, that, again, if everything was equal, but yeah, it's not. And so really, really good online or virtual or asynchronous instruction is still probably far superior to crappy in-person instruction.
I 100% agree. And I would say veterinary technology has gone all online.
Yep.
There are many, many veterinary technology programs that are fully online, and they still have clinical skills because it's a technical skills program that they have to get checked off and do in person at their job or their internship or whatever. And I don't see any reason why we couldn't do that with veterinarians, because in the end, veterinarians they're not any smarter than veterinary technicians most of the time. They've chosen to go a little bit deeper into their field, right? And so
more training in a different area, but
and the skills are maybe a little bit more advanced or a little bit more invasive or whatever, but
that depends on the tech too.
It depends. It also depends on equipment that you're, use. I have technicians who would do way better than with, diagnostic ultrasound and endoscopy than I would.
Depends on what you've been trained for. Yeah.
Right. So, I certainly think that there is room for a fully virtual program in that sense. the caveat being that it has to be high quality, right? So one of the things that I ran into when we were going through this transition at the public health program from sort of all in person to more virtual learning, and this is a transition I had to go through too, because I wasn't a huge fan of it, is that there are lots and lots of people out there, instructors out there, who believe that teaching online is easier than teaching in the classroom, because all they have to do is slap together a PowerPoint and narrate it and put it up and put on a test. And what they don't understand is that there's so much more to teaching, even in the classroom, that they're not really, and maybe they're still crappy at it, but they're not really maybe be able to articulate because they're not thinking about it because they've done it. But to me, teaching well online is so much harder than teaching in person and teaching well in person. So yeah, you're right, Eric. It's certainly possible. The question is, would you be able to find enough faculty who would be willing to put the kind of effort in to make it that quality to really do, what you needed it to do?
I think if you pick and choose from all over the place, there's enough.
Yeah, there's enough. It's just a matter of, I would imagine if we decided to do it and we got funded, that we would be able
to find enough
to find them and bringing exactly the right people. And we could probably be really successful. We'd piss off a lot of other schools, but we'd be able to get it done.
They'd be really mad when we make them obsolete, right?
Right. They'd get over it.
Okay, here's my question. And we've been talking about this kind of flexible and, part or fully online. How do you guys feel about the clinical side or the apprenticeship style training portion? And do you imagine that has to remain, maybe not necessarily in its exact current form, but do you see the apprenticeship style, again, in clinics, whether that's a distributed model or not, like whatever, but do you still see that being a crucial required component of veterinary school?
I think yes and no, right? And so I'm going to qualify that by saying it depends on what that student wants to do. For a student like me, I didn't necessarily need to go through the clinical training because I didn't have any intentions of going into clinical medicine. Mm-hmm. Did it ultimately benefit me? Yes, in retrospect, but had I had a choice, I probably would have not done that. So
what would you have done in place of that?
I probably would have gone and gotten my PhD in education earlier and been doing professional development and educational training much sooner in my career. But that's also saying that a veterinary program would have recognized education. I mean, I came out of veterinary school at a time where it was just starting to be recognized as something that was valuable and is not nearly as recognized as it is now. So I think that's just another thing that we're having to deal with. But I certainly had a student, colleague, classmate who was a year ahead of me who was like, she refused to take the NALI. She's like, I don't want to go into clinical practice. I want to be a researcher. My entire career, all I wanted to do is be a researcher. I got a DVM because I wanted the medical background and information. And I wanted that knowledge, but not because I wanted to be a clinician. I want to be a researcher. And for students like that, why does she need to go suffer through emergency rotations and surgery and large animal?
That's not suffering. What are you talking about? Emergency.
It is suffering if you don't want to do it.
Okay, Eric, what are your thoughts on that question?
I don't know what the alternative is.
Yeah.
I think that for the number of people that we have to train in these disparate skills, I mean, actually, maybe I'm going to answer my own question. The answer might be VR. Right, virtual reality, that we could just sim all of this. Mm-hmm. The effort would be tremendous, but there's no reason that I need to be a human being in this physical place to learn clinical diagnostic skills.
Yeah. Yeah, I struggle with that because, one of the things that I think often happens in veterinary school during that clinical time is where people start putting it all together.
True.
So, and I don't think that has to happen in a clinic setting. But I think even if you're going into research and things like that, there needs to be some way, I think, that you start to say, how am I applying this? And it might not be applying it to treating dogs and cats, but how am I taking this knowledge? And again, and so maybe there's more variety for what you can do at that point. And again, it's not time-based. So as long as, you have, completed various competencies. And also what you're describing, Catherine, I wonder, would it then be, are there different licensing, right?
Yeah.
Like, so if you have somebody who doesn't go to do that, then maybe they shouldn't get licensed to ultimately do it. But yeah, either VR, but also like just different opportunity. This is what I want to go into. These are the competencies that are important for my future career. But I do think there should be some, how are we tying this all together depending on the route that you are taking? And so from like a public health standpoint, it might be, we're going to do some extra epidemiology, but we're going to do some real life scenarios, whether or not they're actual in real time, but like we're going to say, take all the stuff that you've learned, and hopefully you're doing some of that throughout the curriculum. But now this is the challenge where we're trying to really put this all together and really push students to develop their critical thinking skills and problem solving skills, which those are the skills, right, that you can transfer to really any situation. But that's the only thing I would worry about is if we took away the requirement for that apprenticeship style model. What I think in ideal scenario that the students gain the most from is that opportunity to then pull my physiology and pull my pharmacology and apply it to a real world situation. And I would want to make sure we had a way that, again, the competencies are going to be the way, but make sure that we're able to deliver that and give the students opportunities to practice that. Again, different paces, different ways of doing that. But yeah, that's where I struggle a little bit with it. And that's, I'm biased because I spend a lot of time on clinics, and that's where I really get to see and do a lot of that with students. So I would worry about a student who never went through the clinics unless we had something else that was kind of not replacing that, but accomplishing the same kinds of things.
Yeah. So I'm going to make one last comment, and then I'm actually going to lob it back to you, Bobby. I think I agree with you, and I totally see that. And I think one other element of that is then what is the identity of the veterinary profession, right? Because for so long it has been focused on clinical, and I am a huge proponent of educating veterinarians, not just clinicians, but at the same time, 80% of people who go to vet school want to be clinicians. And so if that's the case, then those folks definitely need to go through those. That other 20%, maybe they do, maybe they don't, but certainly, I mean, here at Virginia Tech, our public corporate people still have clinical rotations for a reason, right?
Yep.
So that leads me into my lob to you, Bobby, which is how do you feel about the way the current clinical clerkships are put together? Because everywhere I go, it's, you have an anesthesia rotation, you have an internal medicine rotation, you have a surgery rotation, you have an ECC rotation. And I know we've had conversations about, does it need to be that way, right? Because in our preclinical curriculum at Virginia Tech, we're no longer teaching ologies, we're teaching the healthy animal, we're teaching the next generation, we're teaching everything integrated. So I'm going to lob that back to you.
Yeah. Thank you for that setup. So my ideal is, because at this point we don't have differential licensure, right? Like if you get licensed, you can practice medicine. So at this point, I still want this to be required because
Absolutely.
I'm never going to go into this. You might. And so I do want the students to go through that. However, a very small percentage of them are going to go on and into specialty medicine. And yet they spend the bulk of their time on clinics at various specialties. At least at most, it's not all of them anymore, but most of them. And so my vision would be, and again, if we could do it in the flex model where it's competency-based, this would work really, really well. But my vision would be that they would spend the bulk of their time on clinics in the primary care, and I would argue first opinion emergency type rotations, clinical rotations. That's how I would do it. And then they would have more than two, but okay, I'm sticking to small animal because that's my world right now. So you'd kind of duplicate some of these for small and large animal, and we can talk about the proportions of that, blah, blah, blah. And it would be based more on, again, how many experiences have you got, and have you gotten enough to, you can, check off these competencies. But then you would have, a chunk of time where you were on specialty medicine. That was the name of the rotation. And what would happen is all the students that are on specialty medicine are just there, and they're waiting for a case to come into a specialty service. And then whichever service has an appointment, boom, that student goes to that one. Like, you're not on the cardiology rotation, or you're not on the neurology rotation. Because one of the things that we experience is the caseload is so variable that we have some students sitting around bored to tears and other students that are running around like crazy. And we're not distributing the caseload in a way that makes a lot of sense. And they could keep a portfolio to say, I've seen this type of neurology case. And so the next one that comes up, hey, I've seen that. The person person behind me gets it. And we mix the students up in a way that makes sense for what they're trying to learn, because we're not turning them into a neurologist or a cardiologist or an internist. We're turning them into clinicians. And this is how you get some exposure to the other things. And I think a little bit of that is good. What I would like to do is ask those individual specialists is like, what do you really think the general practitioner needs to know about your specialty? And what, how do we provide them that? Because we also know that they could say, well, they need to see this many blah, 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 blah type cases. Okay. Is that happening? Because I would suspect a lot of the times what they say they need and what they're actually getting isn't happening. And nobody's saying, well, this isn't working. We have to keep them on for 9, 12, 14 weeks until they've seen this number of, this many heart failures so that they can confidently manage heart failure. That's not what we're saying. And so I would love the idea to say, okay, you're going to see a lot of cases on primary care. And I would argue, because what we do on emergency is a lot of, similar to primary care type things, that it's not always, there's some specialty medicine in it, but mostly it's not. There's the critical care side. And again, that would be part of specialty medicine. And then, so that's how that would work. So you'd have students that were assigned to primary care, emergency, and then you would have this whole chunk of students who were just specialty medicine, whatever case shows up. And then here's what this also does. This frees up those clinicians to really work with their house officers. Interns and residents are now getting the bulk of the training on specialty medicine, which is what they've signed up for. Mm-hmm. The students have not signed up for specialty medicine. Now, for the ancillary services, and I don't know if you like that term, I never know what else to say, but so the anesthesia, the radiology, so the not that they're not clinical, but they're not appointment-based, case-based, where you're following this around. Same kind of thing. All right, so you're now on this, ancillary service rotation. So ClinPath, radiology, anesthesia, and you get assigned. There's another case that needs a student for anesthesia. Boom, you come through anesthesia and you follow that case until that case is done. And then when that case is done, you get back in line. And the next thing you might do is go, help with an ultrasound, right? Because that's typically how it works on anesthesia. Anyway, most places I've been, a student gets assigned to this case. Well, who says you have to do that 3 weeks in a row over that 3 weeks? Why can't, you just say, all right, we want to make sure students have a certain number of anesthesia cases that they work through. There's a certain number of scenarios we want them to have been exposed to. And so throughout the year, when you are assigned to, so they can schedule their life, they say, okay, I'm on this ancillary service block. I have a little book and I'm keeping track. Well, I need a thoracotomy case so that I can learn about these procedures, or, whatever we decide is required for students. And okay, these students, and you've got like a little chart, and, we have enough technology that I think this could be done. We say, hey, there's a case that this student needs is up, so that they can, sign off on certain competencies. Boom, you get assigned to that. So that is how I would love to see the clinical education. That's like the weird model that I have in my head right now. Because I just think the proportion of time students are spending on specialty medicine is absolutely disproportionate to what they're going to do when they leave. And if they do go on to specialize, they're going to do an internship, then they're going to do a residency. They're going to get those hours. They don't need them in vet school. Why do they need to learn how to manage, like super complicated, like these are cases that the regular veterinarians have referred elsewhere. They're saying this is not what we manage. And we're putting students on those cases routinely.
Yeah.
Why do we think they get about stuff?
Can I comment on that? I love the idea of you're just on specialty medicine. And you take whatever comes in, because like you say, it smooths out the caseload problems that we see. That is super interesting to me. We I don't know if I'd say solved. We had an approach at Midwestern that I really appreciated, which was the students all worked in pairs.
Okay.
And so they took the case in, say they were on primary care, they took the case in, and then if that case needed radiographs, they went and did the radiographs.
Yeah.
If that case needed anesthesia, one of them was the anesthetist, one of them was the surgeon, if it was a spay or a dental or something that they could do. So they knew the case.
Yeah.
So
and that's more like what they would do in practice.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. They just did everything with that case. And I loved that. And it really minimized the like siloing of expertise and knowledge. And to what you were talking about, Bobby, that on clinics is where you integrate the stuff. Let's get more integration.
Yeah. Yeah.
The other thing that I really, really love about this idea is that it provides so much flexibility for a teaching hospital, right? Because so one of the one of the discussions we're having right now is what are going to be the required clerkships for our small animal track students? And there are a number of faculty who want to say, well, they have to have a neurology, they have to have a dermatology, they have to have a cardiology. Well, that's great. But if we don't have a neurologist and we don't have a dermatologist and we don't have a cardiologist, we can't offer that. And so then we're feeding our students a line that we can't fulfill later. And so this model actually provides us the flexibility. If you're on specialty service for a third or whatever, 20% of your rotations, then whatever specialty people you have in the hospital employed at that time, those are the services you get. And you don't have to choose whether you're going to have dermatology. You don't have to worry about whether or not you have a radiologist. You don't have, you just have specialty service. And there's, okay, next up, it's a neurology case. We have a neurologist because we're taking in neurology cases. We have a cardiologist. We have an oncologist. It doesn't matter because you can just plug in whatever specialist that is.
And that aligns with competency based, right? 100%. Like there's a competency that you have to be able to follow a specialist level neurology case from start to finish. That's not a competency because you know what? These are literally cases that the general practitioners have turned away.
Exactly.
I just can't get.
They're here for a reason.
Exactly. And again, we get some of that on emergency, but if you have a first opinion emergency case, so I feel like that's different. I feel like a lot of what we see on emergency is what they're going to like block cat. Guess what? You need to be able to manage a block cat.
Yes.
Basic stability. So I don't think it's just that I'm biased. I do think that is still accomplishing what we want. And again, the primary care, I think they should be spending. And the nice thing is what you were saying, Eric, is like our primary care service also does a lot of what you're describing, where we're going to do our own anesthesia. We're going to do our, to some degree, it's not always practical. They don't have their own radiology department. So that still happens, but they do try to run more like a typical private practice, single brick and mortar that doesn't just throw the case down the hall because we have a specialty. They really do try to work independently, which I think is amazing for our students, because one of the things that irks me more than anything is, we come on an emergency and, the case has some neurologic signs or cardiac something. And it's like, well, okay, what do you want to, I want a neuro consult.
Yeah.
That is the wrong answer. You haven't even done your own neuro exam. Okay. So usually it's like, okay, well, what's your neurolocalization? Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. You're not going to be able to do that when you're out in practice. That's ridiculous. And so they get kind of into, because that's what happens, right? Like that's what the services will do is like, oh, I'm just going to go do this and I'm going to go do that. I'm like, that's not real life.
Right.
But we're setting it up. So we're saying, again, what we say, and there's what we say, and then there's what we do. And, we say, we want you to be day one ready and you're going to have to do these things. But what we do is we put them 80% of their time is they're working on specialty level cases.
Yeah. And the other thing too, I think we're also seeing a little bit, might be an interesting study, is that we're actually decreasing the confidence of our students going into general practice. And so, for example, when I moved to my second job out of vet school, I was going into my second year of practice, and I had seen an amazing caseload in my first year in practice. Yeah. And I went into a corporate practice where the medical director there had been in practice for 5 years, and I'd been in practice for starting my second year. She was referring out pyometra surgeries. She was referring out C-sections. She was referring out GDVs, like all of these things that would have been creating incredible revenue and skill for her hospital and her associates. She was referring them out. Why was she referring them out? Because she never got to do them in vet school and she didn't have anybody there to teach her, and she felt really uncomfortable doing it. So she was asking me to come in and teach her. So I taught her how to do a pyo. I was like, listen, a pyo and a C-section, they're basically fancy spays, right? So if you can do a spay, you can do a pyo. If there's a little
easier.
bit of
it's really easy to find the uterus.
Exactly. It's so much easier. So there's a little bit of extra caution and precautions you have to take, but essentially it's a fancy spay, right?
Yeah.
I had to teach her how to tack, a stomach to a body wall. And it's not necessarily the easiest thing to do, but it's certainly something a GP can do. And so I think we're also building sort of this tentativeness in our students that's like, well, I'll just refer it to a neurologist or I'll refer it to an ophthalmologist or whatever. And it's like, well, I would say 70% of your, maybe 75 or 80% of your clients, they're not going to go for that. They want you to tell them what's the thing you can do for the least amount of money, because I only have $600 to spend on my dog or my cat or my horse or whatever. And so you better be able to figure out what you can do. And we're not helping them do that if all they're doing is specialty.
And we're also, again, we've got competing goals here too. So if you're a surgeon, a specialist surgeon, and you're trying to train specialty residents, you don't want to get referred a bunch of pyometras and C-sections.
Exactly.
Some of those is fine. Yeah. They, some, but like you're wanting to train them to do those next level things. And so I can certainly understand, but so the caseload that they're attracting, they're doing, fancy orthopedic surgeries and, complicated fracture repairs and things that the general practitioner is like, hey, this is beyond my skill. We're sending it away. And so we're selecting for the worst caseload to train students on.
Yeah.
And then they don't get to do anything because you're like, this is specialty level things. And so I think that's one of the reasons our students really like our ER rotation, because the caseload we're seeing, get in there and do it, it doesn't require a specialist to do a thoracocentesis. And so they get to do a lot more hands-on with this, a lot, because we're not all the time. I'm not having students run ventilators and but the vast majority, 95% of the cases that we see are things that the students, you get in there and do this, because when you're out in practice, I expect that you can do this initial stabilization, right? You might not be able to follow up with the CT scan and things like that, but you can get it stabilized. These are things you can do. And where they can't do that, if somebody's coming in and paying a specialist to fix their animal, they don't want the student up, right? It's not appropriate. And so, we're just selecting for the wrong caseload for a team. Now, great for house officers, right? Wonderful for that. And so why don't we just acknowledge that and tell faculty, hey, we're going to make your lives easier, and we're going to, reduce the number of students that you're seeing. You're going to have students here and there, but mostly you're going to work with your house officers, the specialists are, and then the, the emergency and primary care services. And I would see the same thing in large animal, right? The primary care services in large animal, the ambulatory services. Yes, students should be out doing those types of things in similar proportions, right? But the specialist level, if you're not going to have a facility to do colic surgery, why do we have a bunch of students in, and I don't, maybe that's wrong. Maybe that people are doing colic surgeries out, and I didn't think so. Okay. I was like,
I think I'll add to a future topic, tertiary care hospitals, because I think we could definitely get into this. So major takeaways, me, Bobby and Catherine, I'll give you last word. I think my major takeaway is there's a lot of money to be had. I think this is a thing that could be done. You'd have to really know what you're doing.
Yeah, I like that. I don't know if this is my major takeaway, but it probably is. Never say never, like never say it can't happen, and always ask why. Like, why are we doing these things? And if they're, we have to keep asking the why. And when we don't get a satisfactory answer, try something different.
Yeah. I think my major takeaway is that there is lots of opportunity. But I also have a lot of question. And my biggest question as we leave this conversation is, what is it going to take to make this happen? Right? Because we have 150 years of history and 150 years of tradition and 150 years of we've always done it this way. And some people who are 150 years old who want to uphold that tradition. So what is it going to take, and who's going to be brave enough to take the first step? I think is what I would leave this conversation thinking.
Ooh,
that's great.
It's exciting though.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I love the conversation, and that would have been my next question to you all if we had a little bit more time, is what do you think it's going to take to make it happen? So maybe we can have another episode.
That's probably its own show right there.
We can explore that topic, because I think we do have some new vet schools popping up here and there, and what opportunity might we have there, or are we willing to collect a group of like-minded people and try and do it ourselves? I mean, you might as well, right? I mean, you might as well have those lofty visions. And
I'm Catherine. You said it'd be easy to get the money, so you get the money.
Honestly, I do. I think it would be really easy to get the money. I think there are plenty of people out there who would be willing to try something new. There are plenty of people out there who have kids who wanted to be veterinarians, who wanted to be veterinarians themselves. It wasn't accessible for one reason or another, that have lots of money, that love animals, and that want to see more veterinarians out there. So.
All right, let's do it.
Yep.
Here first. Here we go.
Sounds good.
This was
thanks.
Fun. Yeah.
I liked this one a lot. It was good.
All right. Well, this was really fun for us. Hopefully folks listening were enjoying it. And we'll catch you guys at the next show.